Welcome to Babblecom 5. This is episode 7 of season 4 of Babylon 5, Epiphanies. It looks for a moment like Star Fury squadrons are going to go head to head, but it's just their version of a Red Arrows display as they start trailing whatever passes for smoke in space in celebration of the end of the Shadow War. Franklin is pulled into a jiving Zocalo dance pit as Sheridan watches on, trying to forget about what the victory cost and live in the moment, as Delenn also watches on with him. On Earth, President Clark is apparently rattled and has initiated a program that only he and his inner circle have full knowledge of. Bester is being briefed on the Psy-Core element, the goal being to shut down Babylon 5. Bester wonders why they don't just send in the troops, but his counterpart says it was a disaster last time, so this time they play the long game. Work to undermine their support structure, then move. On Centauri Prime, Londo is preparing to escape back to Babylon 5 given the heat he's drawing after the death of the Emperor and the freeing of Narn. However, before he goes, he lets the highly strung Centauri he's speaking with know that the Centaurum has delayed appointing a new Emperor and has instead appointed someone regent whilst they consider what their next steps are. And it's the highly strung Centauri he's talking to. Should he need his Prime Minister's advice, he'll be on Babylon 5. And on the station, Franklin is examining Jakar's eye socket, the vacant one. It's causing some pain and itching despite its absence due to phantom limb syndrome, but Franklin is cautiously optimistic about getting him a prosthetic that will give him some sight back. He'll need a scan, but Franklin gives him pain meds to tide him over. He asks Jakar about the rumour he was offered a leadership role, and he confirms that, but says that in his experience, power is rarely worth the price you have to pay for it. In his quarters, Garibaldi is still experiencing flashbacks and starts to draw something on his mirror while shaving, then receives a call. CNC can't pin down the source. It displays a brief message full of coloured patterns when Garibaldi plays it. He orders it deleted and the log wiped, then returns to shaving, but wipes off the marks he made on the steam first. Then he joins the senior staff and promptly resigns. Of course he's challenged on it, but he suggests that after all they've been through, they're lucky to still have the option to make a choice about how they want to live their lives. Wasn't that the point? So rather than fight other people's battles for them, he'll go independent, try and help people who lost others during the war. Try and do some good, build a life for himself. That, it seems, is that. As Zack is briefing his security team, one Londo Malari arrives on the station, and Zack hides his delight at seeing him really well. Then just to add to his delight levels, Mr. Bester arrives and invites himself to his usual quarters in the brig, on his way to see the command staff. Plus the captain wants to see him. As he finally leaves before the second coming catches up with him, Elvis comes on board. Several of them. Thank you very much. Garibaldi is packing his security gear. His doorbell chimes and he finds Jakar standing in his doorway. He starts apologising profusely, knowing that his going to look for him has caused him a great deal of pain. Yet the hug Jakar then gives him is not intended to crush him violently to death, although he comes close by accident. It's to welcome him back. He goes on to explain that had he not gone looking for Mr. Garibaldi, the only non-Narn he would have cared to do that for, he would not have been placed in a position to make the deal with Malari that resulted in the freedom of his people. So he is the opposite of angry with him. After he's gone, Garibaldi chuckles and says, even for a Narn, he's nuts. Zack is in no way convinced that there isn't something behind Mr. Garibaldi's resignation, but Sheridan promotes him to Chief of Security in any event. He also asks him to go and see Lita so that they can have telepathic cover when they meet with Bester. Just then they're notified to turn on ISN as they've made the news, for the wrong reasons. President Clark has ordered Babylon 5 quarantined from Earth traffic, with ships seen to be en route to be impounded, clearly an aspect of his plans to isolate the station. Zack sees Lita, who is trying to redecorate her quarters now that she's not under the Vorlon ambassador's thumb, and she notes that people only ever come to see her when they want something from her. Fair comment. Zack is open with her as only Zack can be. There are rumours that she was altered by the Vorlons, and as they're not flavour of the month, neither is she. She acknowledges that she knew this to a degree, but thanks Zack for telling her to her face. He slightly awkwardly offers to help her unpack later with a pizza, which she seems lukewarm about as a concept. On the Zocalo, Londo is negotiating with a merchant, but doesn't seal the deal and turns to find Jakar on the opposite side of the promenade. He is about to evade him, but chooses to approach him instead. Jakar says that with his world free, Londo no longer exists in his universe. He should hope that he never has cause to notice him again, and then he moves off. Bester is being his charming self and says he ought to take Lita back as she's a blip, as Lita said to Zack. But Sheridan confirms in no uncertain terms involving the nailing of Bester's head to the table that she's under his protection and won't be going anywhere. Bester has information on Clark's plans, the propaganda war being the obvious first phase. The second phase comes at a price. Bester wants to go to Zahadum, as he assumes it's now tenant-free, with a view to finding a way to free his lover from her shadow implants. As the command staff discuss this, he tries scanning those presents, but finds he can't, and trying to go for Lita results in his head snapping back and a quiet smile across her face, as he'd just been saying her presence was pointless, as she couldn't block him. Wrong. Although there isn't a consensus, Sheridan agrees to take him, and Bester reveals Phase 2. A local Earth Force outpost has been ordered to patrol the last gate before Babylon 5. However, a Black Omega squadron of Star Furies underslung on transport ships is going to jump the patrol and leave evidence implicating Babylon 5. It's a lose-lose for the station because they get blamed for both attacks, but they've got to launch a force now if they're going to stop the surprise attack. Which they do, as Furies and Thunderbolts launch out, whilst the White Star heads out with Bester on board, eyeing Lita up with new interest. Garibaldi is hunting down station command codes to hand over to Zack, who wonders out loud if he's making a mistake. Garibaldi asks him if he isn't happy about the promotion, but as Zack says he knows that's not what he's talking about. Garibaldi says we all make mistakes, that's life, but this is about choosing his own path, even if it is a massive screw-up. Just as he had faith in Zack in giving him a job, he's asking Zack to have faith back in his direction. Sheridan and Delenn share a moment in the White Star, Sheridan bemoaning the fact that they never get a moment to draw a breath, with Delenn mocking him and calling him a problem solver, that if he ever had any downtime, his head would implode. She calls them old souls as they embrace. The Earth Force Star Furies start challenging the Black Omega transports, whose Furies start powering up, just as Ivanova arrives with Alpha Squadron through the gate and warns off the local Furies before engaging the Omega Furies and transports. The local Furies can't quite believe who's pulled them out of the fire, and Ivanova says reports of their disloyalty are greatly exaggerated. On the bridge of the White Star, Bester decides to change tacks with Lita and try some old-fashioned verbal communication, as he has no chance of getting through to her telepathically, it appears. He knows she's changed, he's just not quite sure in what way, but when he reminds her that Corey's mother, Corey's father, she says that makes her an orphan. But Bester suggests that she has something on her. As they arrive, ships are detected leaving through the local jump gate, only a small one, but not shadow ships. Delenn assumes these are allies of the Shadows, or were, with their own interests. They can detect no chatter from Zahadum itself, and Sheridan puts two and two together, ordering the White Star to come about fast, having guessed quite correctly that the silence was because the Shadows were not about to leave anything behind to be scavenged, and he's proved right as the Shadows' homeworld finally meets its end. And so it seems Bester's relationship with the crew will continue, because as Sheridan has said to Mr. Bester before, it's an imperfect world. Lita smiles quietly. On his return to the station, Bester spends time with his cryogenically frozen lover, telling her that he passed on the orders to the Black Omega pilots, knowing they were going to their deaths. 6 of his best pilots. The squadron is his baby. But he'd sacrifice them all if it meant a chance that he'd be able to speak to her again. He has no one to speak to back home. And whilst the command staff may be laughing now, he still has an ace in the hole that will hurt them more than he's been hurt by them. Sheridan arrives to Lita's quarters to have a cosy chat. Only not so much, because he's realised that the timing of the evacuation and Zahadum's destruction was far too convenient, and has hypothesised that someone who knew from a previous trip that there were telepathically sensitive sensors on the planet could have broadcast ahead to trigger them and the planet self-destruct. Speaking hypothetically, Lita notes that hyperspace has been known to amplify telepathic abilities, but Sheridan says not that much. to block Bester, prevent him detecting the signal, and to send it out in the first place, you'd have to be beyond P12. Theoretically, of course. And he's pleased they're talking hypothetically, because if someone had made that sort of command decision without consulting him, he'd have no compunction about turning them over to Psychor to be turned inside out. And with that, he takes his leave, only to be replaced with pizza-bearing Zack, with a horrible sense of timing, bless him. In Command and Control, it transpires that Clark's play has backfired spectacularly, to the extent that he won't be able to try it again. Sheridan, however, is concerned about the allies of the Shadows, their dark servants, as Delenn put it, what they might have taken with them, and what their intentions might be, and where they might be going. And part of that question may be answered by the closing scene, as we return to Centauri Prime, where the Regent is sleeping fitfully, then awakes, saying it was all just a dream. Yet when he gets out of bed and pulls his bedclothes to one side, he looks at his neck in a mirror, and something's attached there, and its eye opens. This was one of those episodes I didn't remember much about, because it falls into that calm after the storm slot, when you're still trying to process all the events of the previous episode. Yeah, I also really enjoyed it because of that. There was a bit more of the day-to-day of the station, with pretty much everyone back on the station once again, and of course a more unwelcome guest. So let's talk Lita, because she's an increasingly central character, and yet one who, as she observes here, barely gets a look in when it comes to normal social interaction. Shunned by mundanes due to her Volon association, and Teeps because she's in Psychor. With the disappearance of the Volons, she's now out on her own, and in fact the events of this episode demonstrate that while she's frequently acting with the command staff, she isn't really in their chain of command, and doesn't think in the same way about decision making. When Bester pisses her off, she chooses to blow up Zahadum in revenge, unless of course her offhand comments about Volon implanted commands was on the money, and she just isn't aware of it. No thought of letting Sheridan know, ostensibly because Bester could have scanned him down, but he was clearly distracted by her, so she could have. And that, of course, is something that could come home to roost, because if she can give a Psychop the mental equivalent of Whiplash, then as Sheridan notes, she is something off the chart in terms of her psionic abilities now. Yet she's just used as a tool most of the time. And there's poor old Zack bringing pizza when she could just melt his brain in the mood she's in. Bless him. This probably also means that Bester has just added her to his list for Santa in 2261. So Zack is now head of security, owing to the question left unanswered in large part earlier in the season. Whatever happened to Mr. Garibaldi? Do you remember way back in Season 1, Spider in the Web, when a graphical display was used in part to control a remote agent? It seems like Mr. Garibaldi has been fully activated, and the most obvious short-term result is that of his immediate resignation, seemingly to find a new path in life. Everyone close to him knows that this is out of character to some extent, and yet there seems to be enough logic behind it to make it plausible for the time being. Clearly though, this is going to get something new running, and is presumably tied to Clark's overall goal, although that isn't entirely clear, and Garibaldi did hand over the command codes in a straightforward way. Speaking of Clark, clearly trying some good old false flag ops, which are all the rage these days. Surprising that Bester would put his own squadrons next on the line, and interesting too that he'd use his Omega Squadron Fury to travel to Babylon 5. It's not exactly inconspicuous. Yet this is also the most human part of Bester's character we see, when he's trying to get his lover Caroline back at any cost, so he'll clearly put himself on the line to a degree too. There are nice Jakar and Londo moments too, as we find out Jakar's pirate look may not be permanent, and it seems that Londo's return to Babylon 5 might be timely, given whatever's happened to the Regent by the end of the episode. Perhaps the best point is where their paths cross on the station, and it's really hard to judge how they're going to be with each other. For a brief moment, it's like Season 1 Jakar is back, dictating terms to Londo. We haven't really seen that for a long time. So you see, when you take a step back, there really is a lot going on here with the end of the Shadow War. Although it seems like a slow episode in some respects, it's setting up a lot of new plot lines whilst bringing to a close the likes of Zahadum. As Bester notes, it's also impacted Clark, but presumably most of Earth's population just won't know anything about what's been going on, because there was no mention of Earth colonies or Earth being threatened by the Volons. So ironically, Earth's fleet is probably amongst the strongest remaining, Perhaps Earth would have been next after the Vulcans destroyed Centauri Prime. It's not something that I think has ever been raised, but perhaps had the season had more time, that might have been explored. One final thing I wanted to mention, because of the way the Star Furies were animated and rendered here, was shinier than before, is that netted digital animation took over rendering duties from Foundation Imaging for this season onwards. Foundation went off to do Trek series. I have to admit that I always enjoyed Foundation style better than Netter's. I don't know if that's controversial, but things like their explosions in space are always just trying a bit too hard to my mind. It's like, look at me, I'm exploding! Wow! Aren't I pretty? In fairness, little details like the Star Furies powering up in this episode I did enjoy, but I think they start getting a little carried away with what's possible. You start to venture into the area where you do things because you can, rather than doing them because they make sense. Everything just starts to get a bit too busy, when sometimes less is more. See what you think as the season goes on. Join me next week and we'll see how things develop from here.